In 1987, Detroit police raided a house on the east side of the city and found something they were not expecting. Not drugs, not weapons, though there were plenty of both. They found a collection of home videos. In one of them, a young man stands in a room with gold-plated bathroom faucets, shaking a laundry basket overflowing with cash. He turns to someone off camera and says, "Should we throw away the ones since we already have 500,000? The camera pans across stacks of bills arranged on a table like inventory at a warehouse. There is no panic in the room, no urgency, just the calm, almost boring energy of people who have done this so many times that counting $500,000 feels like paperwork. These tapes would later be broadcast on Detroit television. The men in them would be arrested, tried, and sentenced. The leader would receive life in prison. His brothers would receive sentences of 21, 27, and 45 years. Federal prosecutors would call their operation the largest crack distribution network the city had ever seen. At its peak, it supplied roughly half of Detroit's estimated 1,000 crack houses. Revenue was somewhere around $3 million a day. And the strangest part of the entire story is not how much money the Chambers brothers made. It is how they made it. Because the Chambers brothers did not run their empire the way most drug organizations of the 1980s did. They did not rely on chaos, loose alliances, or neighborhood intimidation alone. They ran crack cocaine the way a corporation runs a product line. They had organizational charts pinned to the walls of their houses. They issued photo identification badges to their employees. They ran sales competitions between crack houses. They sent supervisors to pose as customers for quality control. They offered 2-for-1 deals and discount coupons to buyers. They had written bylaws, rules for dress code, prohibitions on wearing gold jewelry or expensive sneakers while on shift, because flashy clothing attracted police attention. And yet, every single one of those systems, the charts, the badges, the coupons, the rules, would eventually end up as evidence in a federal courtroom. The very discipline that built the empire also documented it. The family loyalty that held it together also made it traceable. And the small-town pipeline that supplied its labor force also gave investigators a map leading straight back to the source. But this is not just a story about 4 brothers who sold crack. This is a story about what happens when a dying city and a desperate town collide, and why the most organized drug operation in Detroit's history looked less like a gang and more like a company, because for the people inside it, that is exactly what it was. To understand how the Chambers brothers built what they built, you first have to understand the city they built it in. And in the early 1980s, Detroit was not just declining, it was hollowing out. The numbers tell one version of the story. Manufacturing jobs in the city had dropped from over 338,000 in 1947 to around 153,000 by 1977, and they kept falling. The auto industry, which had made Detroit the industrial capital of the world, was bleeding. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had been moving operations to the suburbs and then overseas for decades. Between 1950 and 1958, Chrysler alone cut its Detroit production workforce in half. And Detroit was a one-industry city. When the auto companies shrank, everything else shrank with them. Suppliers, machine shops, parts manufacturers, restaurants that fed factory workers, stores that sold them clothes. The entire economic ecosystem collapsed in slow motion. By the early 1980s, the city's population had dropped from its peak of 1.8 million in 1950 to well under a million. Whole neighborhoods on the east side sat half empty. Houses could be bought for almost nothing. Entire blocks had more boarded windows than occupied ones. Property taxes went unpaid. Schools deteriorated. City services thinned out until some streets felt abandoned by the government entirely. And the cruelest part of the timing was this. Black workers in Detroit had only recently begun gaining real access to the good factory jobs they had been shut out of for decades. The civil rights movement had started to open doors. And then the factories closed. The jobs moved to the suburbs, then to other states, then overseas. Just as the black community was starting to get a foothold, as one Wayne State University sociologist later put it, the ground underneath them disappeared. The people who stayed, overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly working class, found themselves trapped in a city that had built everything around jobs that no longer existed. This was the Detroit that greeted the crack epidemic. Not a city that was simply poor, but a city that had recently been rich, that still had the bones of its prosperity visible everywhere. In the wide boulevards, the grand apartment buildings, the factory skeletons, and that now had almost no legitimate path left for a young person without a college degree to make a living. And into this vacuum stepped a very specific kind of organization. Before the Chambers brothers, Detroit's drug trade had been dominated by a group called Young Boys Incorporated. YBI had controlled roughly 80% of the city's heroin traffic through the late 70s and early 80s. They were innovative in their own right. They used children as runners and couriers because minors faced lighter penalties if caught. They branded their heroin with product names. They operated with a structure that law enforcement described as corporate. But by the mid-80s, YBI was collapsing under the weight of federal indictments. The leaders were locked up, the network was fractured, and the drug that was about to remake American cities, crack cocaine, was arriving in Detroit at exactly the moment when the old power structure had been swept away. The market was wide open. The infrastructure of abandoned houses and desperate neighborhoods was already in place. All it needed was someone organized enough to fill the gap. That someone turned out to be a 5'5" teenager from the poorest part of Arkansas. Billy Joe Chambers, known as BJ, was born in Lee County, Arkansas, one of 14 children in a family that had worked cotton fields for generations. Lee County sat in the Mississippi Delta, a stretch of the Deep South where the legacy of sharecropping still shaped daily life well into the 1970s. The options for a young black man there were limited in ways that are hard to overstate. Seasonal farm labor, maybe a factory job if you were lucky. The color line still guarded most positions worth having. BJ's older brother Danny had moved to Detroit in the early 70s, following the same route that hundreds of thousands of black families had traveled during the Great Migration. Willie, another brother, followed. He served 2 years in the Army, then settled in Detroit and took a job as a mail carrier for the Postal Service. He saved money, bought some cheap property on the Lower East Side, and in 1983 opened a small party store. BJ arrived in 1978, just 16 years old. He moved in with the Colbert family, who were also from Arkansas, and almost immediately got pulled into the marijuana trade. Terry Colbert was already dealing, and BJ proved to be exceptionally good at it. He was disciplined, attentive, and had a work ethic that even his future prosecutors would struggle to deny. Within a few years, He was running Willie's Party Store and selling marijuana on the side, working almost around the clock. Then, in 1984, a family connection introduced BJ to crack cocaine, and everything changed. The economics of crack were unlike anything the marijuana trade had offered. Powder cocaine could be cooked into rock form cheaply, sold in small units for as little as $5 or $10, and the product was so addictive that customers came back within hours. Where marijuana generated steady income, crack generated exponential returns. BJ recognized this immediately. He also recognized something else. The product needed a different kind of operation. Marijuana could be sold casually. Crack needed volume, speed, and control. BJ made a decision that would define the entire empire. He fired most of his existing employees, keeping only family and people from back home in Arkansas. He brought in Marshall Glenn, known as Cadillac Mario, from Marianna. Glenn began recruiting more young men from the area. BJ brought in Detroit natives Anthony Alexander, known as Tony the Tiger, and Eric Wilkins, known as Fats. But the core of the workforce, the runners, the cooks, the houseworkers, would come from one place, Lee County, Arkansas. Within a year, BJ expanded from 6 crack houses to 50. When Larry, the oldest of the 4 Main brothers, got out of prison in 1985, the operation gained its enforcer. Larry founded what they called the Wrecking Crew, the organization's muscle, built around men he recruited from Arkansas. Otis and Willie rounded out the leadership. 4 brothers, each with a role. BJ was the operator. Larry was the enforcer and strategist. Willie handled property and logistics. Otis managed supply routes. And by 1986, they made a purchase that turned their scattered network of crack houses into something that looked less like a drug operation and more like a headquarters. They bought the Broadmoor. If you have ever seen the movie New Jack City, you have seen a version of what the Chambers brothers did to the Broadmoor apartment building. The film's fictional Carter Apartments, where Nino Brown's crew takes over an entire building and converts it into a crack fortress, was based directly on what the Chambers brothers did at 1350 East Grand Boulevard. The Broadmoor was a 4-story, 52-unit red brick apartment building at 1350 East Grand Boulevard on Detroit's East Side. It had been built in a different era, when the boulevard was lined with grand homes and the neighborhood hummed with factory wages. By 1986, the building was deteriorating, and the brothers bought it for $75,000, a price that tells you everything about the state of Detroit real estate at that moment. An entire apartment complex for less than the cost of a mid-range car. Larry oversaw the building. He set up a system where different floors sold different-sized rocks, escalating in price and quantity as you went higher. The operation ran around the clock. Armed security was posted at entrances and stairwells. Some apartments were used for cooking, others for storage. Prostitutes worked in designated rooms. Addicts lined up outside and moved through the building like customers at a service counter, each one processed quickly, efficiently, and sent on their way to make room for the next. A local television journalist, who later got inside the Broadmoor, described it as a well-guarded vice emporium, with crack sold on each floor and filthy mattresses lining the rooms. But the Broadmoor was just the crown jewel. By the mid-'80s, the Chambers organization was running or supplying somewhere between 200 and 700 crack houses across Detroit's East Side. depending on which estimate you trust. The numbers varied because the brothers had essentially built a franchise model. Some houses they owned and operated directly. Others they supplied on an exclusive basis, functioning more like distributors than street-level dealers. And the system they built to manage all of this was genuinely unlike anything law enforcement had seen in Detroit's drug world. If you enjoy deep dives, where the real story turns out to be stranger than the headline, subscribe to the channel. Because the business model the Chambers brothers invented was not just effective, it was so well documented that it practically prosecuted itself. The thing that separated the Chambers organization from every other crack crew in Detroit was not the volume of drugs or the amount of money. It was the paperwork. When investigators raided the crack houses, they found organizational charts taped to the walls, not metaphorical charts, actual diagrams showing who reported to whom, which houses belonged to which supervisor, which lieutenants were responsible for which territory. They found employee photo identification badges, the kind of thing you would expect at a warehouse or a factory, issued to workers so that supervisors could keep track of a workforce that, at its peak, numbered between 300 and 500 people. They found written rules, bylaws for employees, no wearing gold chains or expensive sneakers on shift because flashy clothing drew police attention, no using the product, no stealing from the supply, no freelancing. Workers were expected to show up on time, follow instructions, and meet sales targets. Supervisors would occasionally visit crack houses, posing as regular customers to check on product quality, a form of quality control that any retail chain would recognize. And then there were the marketing tactics. The Chambers brothers offered discount coupons to repeat buyers. They ran 2-for-1 promotions. They held sales competitions between crack houses with bonuses for the highest performing locations. These were not innovations born from reading business textbooks. They were practical solutions to a practical problem. How do you move enormous quantities of an addictive product through hundreds of locations staffed by teenagers who have no reason to be loyal to you unless you give them one? The answer the Chambers brothers arrived at was essentially the same answer that any franchise operator arrives at. You standardize the product. You standardize the process. You incentivize performance. You punish deviation. And you control the labor supply. That last part was where the story takes its darkest turn. The labor pipeline from Marianna, Arkansas to Detroit was the engine of the entire Chambers operation, and it was also the detail that eventually drew national attention. The involvement of a future president and the moral horror that separated this case from dozens of other drug prosecutions of the era. The brothers would drive back to Marianna in gleaming BMWs and Camaros, wearing expensive clothes and gold chains, with girlfriends and cash, and an energy that the town had never seen from anyone who had grown up there. In a town of 6,000 people with no movie theater, with boarded-up storefronts lining the main streets, and summer jobs that meant wrenching labor in the rice and soybean fields for a fraction of what the Chambers brothers were flashing around, the brothers looked like proof that there was another world out there. The local police chief later said everyone in Marianna knew when the brothers were in town recruiting. They offered young men, most between 17 and 21, around $2,000 a month to come back to Detroit with them. The pitch was simple: come north, work hard, make real money. One teenager later recalled the mood. People were saying, "I am going to Detroit. I am going to Detroit." Nobody really knew what they were getting into. Over 4 years, roughly 150 young men made the trip north. What they found was not what they had been promised. The recruits were put to work in the crack houses immediately. They were runners, couriers, cooks, sellers. The hours were long, the conditions were harsh, and leaving was not as simple as quitting a job, because the brothers knew exactly where every one of these kids came from. If a recruit from Mariana tried to run, the Chambers brothers knew his family, his street, his mother's house. A Chicago recruit could disappear into the city. A kid from Mariana had nowhere to hide. The punishment for stealing was permanent. One teenager returned to Mariana with mangled fingers. Workers who sampled the product were beaten. The enforcement arm, Larry's wrecking crew, maintained discipline through a combination of intimidation, beatings, and occasional shootings. In 1987, a 20-year-old lieutenant named Leonard Ruffin was shot and killed outside a crack house on the east side, a death that highlighted just how dangerous the hierarchy was for the people inside it. One academic who studied the case later described the Chambers brothers as modern slave traders, bringing kids up from the South and locking them in crack houses. The comparison was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. The Mariana Pipeline was a grotesque mirror image of the Great Migration. The same route, the same promise of opportunity in the industrial North, the same exploitation at the other end. Except this time, the factory was a crack house, and the product was poison. And yet, for all the violence and control, the system worked. At its peak, the organization was generating an estimated $55 million a year. The brothers lived accordingly. Gold-plated faucets, luxury cars, cash in laundry baskets. They were so comfortable, so confident that they filmed themselves. They made home videos of their wealth, their houses, their lifestyle. 9 tapes in total. The kind of footage that, in a different context, would be a corporate promotional reel. Here is the question that makes this story more than just a drug case, and it is a question worth sitting with for a moment. The Chambers brothers built a system. It was organized, hierarchical, efficient, and disciplined. It had rules, structure, accountability, and incentive programs. If you removed the product, the crack, and replaced it with car parts or electronics or fast food, you would be looking at a competent small business that scaled effectively into a mid-sized operation. So was this criminal genius? Or was this simply what happens when capable people have zero legitimate outlets in a city that had already abandoned them? Was the structure a sign of how dangerous they were, or a sign of how wasted their talents were? Drop your take in the comments, because the answer to that question changes everything about how you read what happened next. By 1987, the Chambers brothers were the most visible drug operation in Detroit. And visibility is the one thing a drug empire cannot afford. The problem was structural, and it was ironic in a way that almost felt designed. The same corporate discipline that made the operation efficient also made it legible. Organizational charts are useful tools for managers. They are devastating exhibits for prosecutors. Photo ID badges help supervisors keep track of hundreds of employees. They also help a grand jury identify defendants. Written bylaws explain how a business runs. They also explain, in the organization's own words, how a criminal conspiracy functions. Discount coupons prove customer outreach at a retail chain. At a crack house, they prove distribution. The Chambers brothers had essentially built the prosecution's case for them, laminated it, filed it in order, and pinned it to the wall. All investigators needed was access, and by the mid-'80s, access was coming from multiple directions at once. The No Crack Crew, a unit within the Detroit Police Department, had been hitting Chambers' crack houses with increasing frequency. A joint investigation between the DEA and the Detroit Police, launched in mid-1986, ran for 18 months, building a case through surveillance, informants, and the testimony of disaffected recruits. Some of those recruits were the same teenagers who had been brought up from Mariana, kids who had been promised $2,000 a month and instead found themselves locked in crack houses, beaten for mistakes, and trapped by the fact that their bosses knew exactly where their families lived. When some of those kids started talking, the information they provided was extraordinarily detailed, because the organization they described was extraordinarily well organized. The home videos were the final nail. When police raided Larry's house and found the 9 tapes, they discovered footage that was almost comically incriminating. Associates counting enormous stacks of cash, displays of luxury, conversations about money on camera. One tape featured a man named William Jackson, known as Jack, shaking a laundry basket of bills and asking if they should throw away the ones since they had 500,000. The tapes were broadcast on WXYZ television in Detroit as part of a week-long investigative series that drew enormous ratings. The Chambers brothers went from being a law enforcement problem to being a public spectacle. In February 1988, all 4 brothers were arrested. The raids seized $1 million in cash and jewelry, 68 vehicles, 250 weapons, and 6 kilograms of cocaine. The scale of the seizure matched the scale of the operation, and the case became so prominent that Bill Clinton, then governor of Arkansas, mentioned the Chambers brothers by implication during his speech at the 1988 Democratic National Convention, pointing to the takedown as evidence of federal action against the drug crisis. The trial lasted 6 weeks. On October 28, 1988, all 4 brothers and 5 associates were convicted. The sentencing came in March of 1989. Willie Chambers received 21 years and a $350,000 fine. Otis received 27 years and a $350,000 fine. Billy Joe, the operator who had started it all with a party store and a bag of marijuana, received 45 years and a $500,000 fine. And Larry, the enforcer, the leader, the man whose house had held the tapes, received life in prison and a $250,000 fine. Judge Richard Sir Heinrich gave the maximum sentence to 8 of the 9 defendants. The U.S. Attorney called it a significant dent in Detroit's crack trade. But even he acknowledged the problem was continuing. And that was the final truth of the Chambers brothers' story. The empire fell. The conditions that created it did not. Detroit did not suddenly regain its manufacturing jobs after the sentencing. No factory reopened because 4 drug dealers went to prison. Mariana did not suddenly develop economic opportunities for its young people just because the pipeline had been cut. The East Side neighborhoods where the crack houses had operated did not suddenly fill with investment and employment and hope. The abandoned houses were still abandoned. The empty lots were still empty. The schools were still underfunded. The vacuum that the Chambers brothers had filled was still there, open and waiting, and other crews moved into the space almost immediately. The crack epidemic continued for years. The war on drugs continued for decades. The sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine, which hit black defendants hardest, continued as federal policy until 2010. And Marianna, Arkansas, was left with a wound that still has not healed. The town's name became associated nationally with the Chambers Brothers pipeline. For years afterward, news stories about drug trafficking, violence, and poverty would reference Marianna in the same breath as the Chambers case. The young men who had been recruited, the ones who survived, went home to a community that was now branded. The ones who did not survive, the ones who were shot, beaten, imprisoned, or consumed by addiction, became footnotes in a case that was already fading from public memory. For more stories where the empire is built on something that should not have worked but did, and where the fall reveals more than the rise, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because there is one more thing about the Chambers Brothers that almost nobody talks about. Go back to the beginning. Go back to the tape. A young man stands in a room with gold-plated faucets, shaking a basket full of cash. He is laughing. He turns to the camera and asks whether they should throw away the ones. In that moment, he is not a gangster. He is not a criminal mastermind. He is a kid from the Mississippi Delta who has more money than he has ever imagined, who has no concept that the camera recording his joy will eventually be played in a courtroom, then broadcast on television, then referenced in a presidential speech. The Chambers Brothers called themselves the Cash Money Brothers. The FBI called them a continuing criminal enterprise. Detroit called them the biggest crack operation the city had ever seen. A sociologist at Wayne State University called them a mockery of the Great Migration. A journalist named William Adler wrote a book about them and titled it Land of Opportunity. Every one of those names tells part of the truth, but the part that stays with you, the part that makes the Chambers story more than just another drug empire, is the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Not just to the recruits from Marianna, though that gap was monstrous, but to the brothers themselves. 4 kids from a cotton farming family in the poorest part of Arkansas, who came to Detroit looking for the same thing that every family who ever drove north on Highway 61 was looking for: opportunity, stability, a way to build something that lasted. They built something, all right. They built something so organized, so disciplined, so thoroughly documented that it lasted exactly long enough to prove one point: that in a city where the legitimate economy had collapsed, the underground economy would adopt every single structure and incentive of the one it replaced. Org charts, employee badges, quality control, franchise models, performance bonuses, a rural labor pipeline. The Chambers Brothers did not invent a new kind of crime. They applied the logic of the factory to the street. And in Detroit, the city that had perfected the factory and then lost it, that logic fit like a key in a lock. The Broadmoor apartments are gone now. The crack houses are gone. Most of the East Side blocks where the operation ran have been demolished or abandoned. Billy Joe, Otis, and Willie eventually completed their sentences. Larry remained incarcerated. Marianna is still one of the poorest towns in Arkansas. Detroit is still rebuilding. And somewhere, in an evidence locker or a federal archive, those 9 home videos still exist. A young man shaking a basket of cash, asking if they should throw away the small bills. He does not know yet that every dollar in that basket is a piece of evidence. that every person in that room is a future defendant, that every frame of that tape is a map leading straight back to a cotton field in Lee County, Arkansas, where a family once picked someone else's crop and dreamed of building something of their own. They did build it. They just built it out of the wrong material. And the blueprints they left behind were so perfect that anyone, a prosecutor, a journalist, a sociologist, or a kid watching from Mariana with nowhere else to go, could follow them.